Well, hi everybody. Thank you for joining us for our first live creator chat of the day, or second live creator chat of the day, sorry, with Greg Rucka. Thanks for joining us, Greg. We appreciate
I,
you being here.
I am delighted to be here. Thank you for
Uh,
having me.
of course. Before we begin, I just want to remind everybody that although we will be structuring this partially as an interview, this is also an Ask Me Anything style chat. So any audience members having questions can put them in our text chat and we will read them out throughout the discussion.
Well,
Appreciate you guys being here.
we'll read most of them. I mean, if your question is entirely inappropriate or rude, I suppose we
Well,
reserve the right to be like, not answering that. So,
yes, I'll store that one away in a scrapbook of weird stuff.
yes, we've had them before.
Yeah. So, for those of you who are not familiar, Greg Rucka is a New York Times bestselling author of hundreds of comics and nearly 24 novels. He has written for film, television, video games, and is currently writing the newest chapters of The Old Guard with Image Comics, as well as the fantastic comic Black Magic.
And
He made,
Lazarus. And Lazarus.
and Lazarus.
You can't forget. It only comes out once a year, but we're still working on it.
It's highly worth the wait. You may know The Old Guard from its most recent adaptation with Netflix. However, there is a new anthology book out now that you can read in which Greg has collaborated with lots of other fantastic comic book creators. Greg, for anyone who might not be familiar, can you give us a little background about The Old Guard, where it's been and where it's going now?
The quick pitch is that there are a group of immortal soldiers, the oldest of whom is a woman who tells everybody her name is Andromache the Scythian, who's about 7,000 years old. And the youngest is a 27, now about 28-year-old African-American Marine named Niall Freeman. And it's a cross between a Looney Tunes Roadrunner cartoon, because you can do anything to these people. I mean, literally anything you can do to the coyote, you can do to the Old Guard. In the first story that Leandro Fernandez and I did, and Leandro's the co-creator of the series with me, he's my collaborator, and he's an incredibly talented artist. There's literally a sequence where they need to escape a situation and jump out a 30th floor window, knowing full well that it will hurt, but they will be okay eventually. So there are elements of very Black comedy. And then I suppose on a more literary approach, if we want to be a little more highfalutin, it is sort of a meditation on the necessity of death and on grief and mourning. It took me a while I was working on the first story. I was the first one I think ran 5 issues, and I think I was on issue 4 before I realized, oh, I'm writing about the death of my father. That's what I'm actually writing about. I'm trying to come to terms with having lost my hero, you know, and trying to articulate what death means in the course of our lives, and what it would be like to, I mean, Andromache in many ways, Andy in many ways, is an incredibly tragic figure. I mean, 7,000 years old. She has been everywhere. She has seen everything. She has experienced all of it. There are lines that reference the fact that she's forgotten more languages, you know, and I think there's actually a line, she has forgotten more ways to kill than entire armies will ever learn. But this is a woman who has experienced every culture and lived in them and experienced there's not a tongue she can't speak. And yet through all this time, the only thing that makes these characters quote unquote special is that they seem to not be able to die until, of course, they can. So they live with this, they live like we do, right? We don't know if today is our last day when we get up. We don't know what's going to happen. They just know that the things that normally end lives don't always work on them.
Mhm.
So there is this existential melancholy to their existence of moving through a world where every connection they know is going to end.
Mhm.
And in a way, it forces an immediacy to their experience of life. Now, all that said, it's an action adventure, because they're soldiers and they have guns and people try to shoot them, and then they can be shot a lot and then they get up again. And Leandra's style is, unlike, say, my collaborator on Lazarus, Michael Lark, who is, I wouldn't say photorealistic, but he is almost documentarian in his art style.
Mhm.
Leandro has a more cartoonish style. He plays with caricature a lot. So the humor in the series, in particular in the comics, comes across. And we can get away with doing, there are books where there are acts of violence and you look at it and you're like, oh, that is horribly distasteful.
Yeah.
And with Leo, it is comic. I mean, it's literally, they've been shot 30 times and half of Andy's skull is missing, and you're not looking at brains flying around. They generally look just annoyed.
Yeah.
There is a mirth to it that I think files the sharper edges. So
Yeah.
that was a long explanation. I apologize.
It was thorough. There's 3 volumes.
There you go. There
It
you
was
are. Yeah.
necessarily thorough.
Yeah.
But I think it's interesting that you mentioned so between Lazarus and the Old Guard and Michael Lark and Leandro Fernandez, you are working with 2 different teams on 2 different perspectives, 2 completely different narratives that both play with ideas of extended lifespan and obligation and family.
You could extend that to black magic as well very easily. Rowan, the series that I do with Nicholas Scott is about a witch named Rowan Black, but one of the things that the series is very much about is the cyclical history of her family and other families in the tradition that she's been dealing with. So yeah, I guess somewhere about 2009, now you've asked me a question that has me being introspective. I left DC under a very dark cloud in 2009 and was in a very, very dark place for several years and found it very difficult to work. And then the 3 projects that all seem to have come out of that period are all in some way about legacy and longevity and I guess what we leave behind and what it means. So yeah, something happened there where I guess that depression, and it was clinical depression. I did not identify it successfully at the time, but it was pretty bleak. I guess all those really, really dark thoughts turned to, let me externalize them into narrative, But the thing with the Old Guard in particular is that the Old Guard is one of those rare works for me where I sat down and Leo and I had talked about it and I had the idea for a long time. But when I sat down to actually write it, the most important thing was just have fun with it. Which is why it took me about 4 issues before I was like, oh, this is what I'm actually writing about. So yeah, it's interesting. I suppose you put me on an analyst couch, we could get a lot out of that. But
yeah, we can pick it apart.
Yeah.
I'll start a podcast so that we can explore it. Sorry about that.
No worries.
Beyond these 3 stories that sort of all talk about legacy, you have worked in many different genres. You're super prolific. Do you find that you go through cycles of meta narrative and this is just one of those cycles?
I'm I mean, I'm not sure what you mean
Well,
specifically about meta narrative.
so working throughout multiple genres,
Yeah,
you tell all sorts of different types of stories.
yeah.
I'm wondering if there are any other themes that you've identified from throughout your career,
Oh,
like a
good
theme
Lord,
of
yes.
legacy that,
Yeah, I mean, there are things that I've always been interested in and I can't get away from in my work. And I feel very strongly that, and I encountered this very early on. I'm not a fan of creators of any art who put it out into the world and then just say it is what it is, and I bear no responsibility for how you read it. Um, I understand the Mammoth-esque argument of it is art for the sake of art, but if I'm going to put words into the world or a story into the world, I need to own it. And I want to have responsibility for what I'm saying. It's one of the reasons why I'm very proud of the old guard. Um, the representation in the old guard matters. And that is something that, and we're approaching pre-production on the sequel, on Tog 2. And the discussions I'm having with the director right now about our responsibilities in representation are I mean, these are live conversations, right? We are interrogating all of our choices. So I've had, I had somebody once ask me in an interview what my thing was about fathers and daughters. Like, I'm always writing about fathers and daughters. And this came up in the Kodiak series of novels, right? Which is sort of how my career started as a novelist, with the Atticus Kodiak series, which was this strange sort of suspense thriller series following a personal protection specialist, a bodyguard. And this critic slash interviewer had pointed out quite correctly, and I hadn't seen it. It's like, what is going on there? And I'm like, I don't know. I have always interrogated questions of sexuality and gender. This may be the result because, as much as I look like a cishet white guy, I have not felt like a cishet white guy for much of my life. And I'm not even sure where I am on that spectrum right now. I am fascinated by gender roles. It's one of the reasons why I love, and now it's an old trope. I mean, this is not, and I certainly didn't invent it, but we have so many narratives. And again, it goes to the representation issue, right? We have so many narratives where the protagonist was a white guy. And if you just change your protagonist's POV and are honest to it, if you say, okay, so instead of a guy, it's a gal, and then you are honest to that, the dividends are extraordinary in the story. If you are fair to it, if you're writing a woman protagonist, for instance, as just another guy, but this one happens to have breasts, you're failing. And in the same way, I was identified oddly very early on in my novel writing career as an African-American writer, I suppose on the basis of a book jacket photo. And I got really upset about it, not because I don't want to be identified as African-American, but because I'm not. It's not my heritage. And at the time I was coming into novels, we were finally seeing in the mystery genre Walter Mosley, Gar Anthony Haywood, I mean, a long list finally of African-American voices really rising in the genre. And for me to claim any of that experience was false, right? I wasn't writing from that perspective, and had not educated myself enough to do so with respect and to honor it, to be fair to it. So, I mean, you can look through the body of work, and right now it's a pretty big body. I've been doing this almost 30 years. And, you can be like, oh, this was Rucka's lesbian phase, for instance. Picasso had his blue phase.
Yeah,
Somewhere in the early aughts, I started, you look at Gotham Central with Montoya.
it's one of my
Um,
favorite books.
well, and again, that was a case of that, Renee was always queer to me. Like from
Yeah,
the moment I met her, and I didn't understand why nobody had written this story. And I was like, okay, well, this is the story this character is telling me she needs told. I'm going to tell it.
yeah.
Um, I don't think I leave any of these particular things behind, right? I think they just get added to whatever the cognitive creative stew that is, the messed up thing in my head. But yeah, so I mean, if you ask me what I'm trying to, I can tell you what I'm trying to explore right now
Mhm.
overtly, but God knows what the text will actually prove when people read it. Um, so
I mean, that's the interesting thing about the creative process is you never know what you're going to end up with, and you never know how people are going to interpret it. And then that's going
well,
to cause you to interpret it differently.
yeah, and it's the way I write. I mean, I know that there are incredibly talented writers in our genre. I think of, Kelly Sue DeConnick, I think of Matt Fraction, I think of Jonathan Hickman, who I also think of incredible structure. They're incredible structuralists.
Yeah.
Like if you've ever seen Fraction's work process, this guy has comp books, and 18, 20 different color pens and pencils that he is working with all the time. And I have unfinished notebooks all around me. And I will beat things out depending on the story, but I don't tend to build. I tend to follow, I guess, maybe the way to put it. And for me, it works, but it requires me hearing what I'm trying to do.
Mm.
And a lot of times I'm deaf to it. A lot of times I need somebody to come along and say, did you realize you were writing about this? And then I'll look at it and be like, no, I didn't. But yes, you're right. I thought I was writing about this thing instead. So
And I think that's fascinating for me as an outside observer to hear about your process, because when you look at your books, things like Lazarus or Black Magic or the Old Guard, it seems that there's a lot of research and a great deal of background knowledge that goes into making these stories, because they're often, even though you write very character focused, the world building is insane.
mm-hmm.
So how do you structure your research then if you're letting the
uh,
story tell you where it goes?
well, so it's situational, but in many cases, what will happen is I'll get engaged by the idea. I'll begin researching it, and good research will always provide story.
Mm.
And one of the things I learned early on, and there's a question that just came up about whiteout, for
Yeah.
instance, and that's a great example. Hi, Aaron. Um, whiteout came about because my first literary agent said to me in passing that there was a U.S. federal marshal stationed in Antarctica. And my first thought was, who did you have to piss off to get that job? I mean, that was quite literally my first thought, was like, did you sleep with the senator's kid? I mean, what did you do to get posted to Antarctica?
Yeah.
And I was so intrigued by that idea that I went, at that time I was living in Eugene, Oregon. And we had moved, my wife and I, Jennifer was attending the U of O. We had been living in LA. I was at USC and I'd gotten my master's, and we ended up living in like the only apartment building in downtown Portland because we still had this New York sense to us. And we were right next to the library, and I went into the library and I spent days just pulling all the books on Antarctica and reading them. And that led, I've said this before in other interviews, research to me is an iceberg. 90% of your research is never ever going to be on the page, but that 90% informs the 10% you show.
Yeah.
And if God is in the details, then the depth of the research feeds those details.
Yeah.
So Whiteout literally came about, is this true? Turns out it's not entirely true, that my agent at that time was wrong. But that in actuality, what happens is that the station manager at McMurdo gets deputized as a marshal. But I found that less dramatic. I wanted somebody who had been exiled. And then the second I started researching what it was like to live in Antarctica, I was like, oh my God, this is brilliant. It's a locked continent mystery. You know, for half the year, nobody's in or out. How do you let that go? So when I'm researching something like the Old Guard and I'm, you know, trying to figure out Andy's history, and Andy's a great example of the kind of mistakes I make. Andy being 7,000 years old means that she is born at the end of the Stone Age and the beginning of the Bronze Age, I believe. I believe we go stone to bronze, stone to copper. There's almost no historical record on the Copper Age because everything got melted down to be made bronze. So there's this huge gap that I have her born in that I can't find anything about. And I'll send Leo, okay, we've got a flashback to Andy's childhood. And Leandro will also do a lot of research, and he'll go looking, what were they wearing? And I'll be like, hell if I know.
Nobody knows. Nobody knows.
All we know is they didn't have buttons yet, right? I mean, literally, we have asked ourselves, do they have belts? What would the belt be? Is it simply going to be sinew that they've tied, or is there a toggle system? And when we were filming the Old Guard, the first one, we were filming in London, and I remember on a day off going to the British Museum and desperately looking for anything. And like, there's one tiny exhibit of like 8 pieces that they think these are copper aged pieces of jewelry. And I'm like, you people are useless. This is the British Museum, and this is useless to me.
Spent all that time colonizing for what? For nothing.
Exactly. All these cultures you stole from, and I needed one thing, British Museum. Yeah,
you couldn't get me one belt.
Exactly. So, you know, good research will inform, but I also feel very strongly that, you know, you're writing a fiction, and the goal is to provide a verisimilitude within the world you have created. So you play in your rules. But sometimes, you know, don't let the facts get in the way of a good story.
Yeah.
But be open to the fact that sometimes the facts will give you a better story. My 4th novel, called Shooting at Midnight, came about almost entirely because I was still living in Eugene, and I spent about 3 weeks following around and interviewing a DEA agent who had come out from Alabama because of the meth epidemic, right? And had been brought in to head up the investigations in mid and southern Oregon. And the actual truth of the way informants work and so on absolutely dictated the way the novel went. Like, that novel, when I started conceiving it, was one very separate thing. The novel that followed it, Critical Space, the same thing happened. I had there was a sequence. I thought the book was going to go one way. I'm halfway through it, and quite literally the characters went on strike. They just were like, you're wrong, that's not the story. And the result of that was I ended up doing 2 weeks of rapid research. We were living in Portland, and I was at Powell's buying all these books. I snuck into the Oregon Ballet Theater's I had misunderstood that they would do a lunchtime brown bag rehearsal where you could come in and have your lunch and watch them rehearsing. Turns out, no, it wasn't open, and somehow I'd managed to get in there and watch.
You just looked so official that they were like, he should be here.
I
Yeah.
didn't. I look pretty much as ratty as I do now. So I remember them looking at me very curiously up in the orchestra seats and or balcony in mezzanine seats, and I guess I was behaving myself enough that they were like, "We'll just ignore the guy." So yeah, it was knowing the things I don't know is a crucial part of being a writer. I mean, we talk about Renee Montoya, for instance, we talk about Gotham Central. I was really lucky in that at that time, and you got to remember, this was early 2000s.
Yeah.
This was still a very live discussion. People were not coming out readily.
Oh yeah, I remember it. Yeah.
Yeah, and Joan Hilty, who's a renowned editor in the industry and who is queer, was at DC, and she was a primary resource. She wasn't on the book. The book was being edited by Nachi Castro and Matt Idelson, but I made a point of like sending every script to her and just saying, get your eyes on this as an editor, as a woman, and as a gay woman. Let me know if I don't want to be dumb. I don't want to make a stupid mistake here. I want to be fair and honest.
Yeah.
I think humility, I think writers who do not have humility should not be trusted.
Yeah. I think that I actually will go ahead and apply that to all of humanity.
Okay.
I'm just going to blanket make that proclamation right now.
I suspect you're absolutely right. I think a little humility would serve all of us a lot better.
Yeah.
But I realize I'm talking a lot and I'm like blocking all question time or whatnot. I apologize. I don't know how we want to proceed at this point.
No,
what little time we have left.
This has been proceeding super well. I mean, the point of this is to be a really interesting discussion, and thus far we have accomplished that.
Hopefully.
We did get one other comment, and that one is from Cheryl. Thank you, yes. Cheryl. Wanted to say that the novelization of Batman No Man's Land is amazing and the best version of the story.
That was an interesting write, because I had to finish the novel before we knew how the comics were going to finish.
Oh, that's right.
And I'm actually incredibly proud of that novel. It is a book that it benefits from being a novel, in a way that a year-long comic book story that was being assembled as it went could not. Right? I could, for lack of a better way to put it, I could play with themes and through lines and tighten the narrative in a way. So I'm always glad to hear it, because I'm actually like very proud of that book. Yeah. It seems to be the book that the most people have read. Logically, it's got Batman on it,
obviously.
And also I've never seen a penny from it, which boggles my mind.
Oh,
but that's just the nature of the industry.
Yeah. That's sadly another conversation that we'll have to move from the podcast to a TED Talk.
Yeah. Well, yes, and I will happily do that podcast.
Yeah.
And I see Aaron's asked what I'm reading right now. I'm reading Spencer Ackerman's new book, which I am finding, or actually I should say I've just finished it. I've found it incredibly depressing. And incredibly accurate about, its reign of terror, and it's effectively how we've screwed ourselves into the unending war state.
Yeah.
So on the nonfiction side, on the fiction side, this is an embarrassing admission, I am actually reading for the first time the Continental Ops stories by Dashiell Hammett.
Oh,
my hard-boiled detective fiction education was formative in me becoming a writer and a novelist, but for whatever reason, I always found Hammett difficult to get into. And I finally sat down and read The Maltese Falcon, and then was like, well, maybe I should pick up Red Harvest. And I was just in New York, and I went to the Mysterious Bookshop, and I found there this huge reprint of like all the Continental Off stories and all the serialized versions as well.
Yeah.
So I've picked that up. Steve Hawkins-Smith's got a series about two brothers set in the Old West, the Holmes on the Range series, which are light and frothy and not quite Sherlock Holmes pastiches, but they're homages that I really like. I like those a lot. I have been, and we'll be talking later today with Andrew and Nathan.
Yeah.
And or Robert and Dave, depending on if we're using their pen names. And Robert, after years, got me into Terry Pratchett. I had never read Pratchett.
Oh my God, I'm so happy for you finding it for the first time.
Oh, when we see each other, you will get to see here on me is Granny and Tiffany. All right. For the longest time, if you were to ask me who my favorite author is, I would have said Douglas Adams. I love the whimsy and the humor, and there's brilliance in those books that I think gets overlooked as people go, it's comedy.
Yeah.
And then I met Terry Pratchett, and I was like, sorry, Doug, you're moving into a strong second.
You gotta live with the in-law now.
But it is going to be an everlasting sadness to me that so much of my early career, I know I was in places Pratchett was.
Oh God.
And I never got to meet him.
Yeah.
And never got to say to him, oh my God, these are beautiful and brilliant stories. And when we talk about what fiction can do, one of my favorite novels of his is Feet of Clay.
Yeah.
It is a novel about the absolute vile inhumanity of slavery.
Yep.
And he uses the word slave once in that book, only once in that, in 120, 150,000 words.
Yeah.
Does he actually need to call it what it is? And it is a devastatingly beautiful book.
Yeah.
That Small Gods. I love all the Tiffany books. His quote unquote young adult books are uniformly the best that he wrote.
Yeah.
And very few of his books are like the first 2-3 Discworld books. He's a little wobbly because he's still writing pastiche. He hasn't realized what he's got.
Yeah, he's building it.
But yeah, Morris is brilliant. All of the Tiffany books are brilliant. My wife wants us to grow into Granny and Nanny. As far as she's concerned, she's Nanny.
I believe in this future for you.
I'm not smart enough to be Granny Weatherwax, but that might be the greatest compliment I've ever been paid. So yeah, that's
kind of a strong relationship.
Yeah, it is. So yes, that's what I'm reading now. And we got books everywhere. There's always something floating across. I'm reading Parable of the Sower as well. So, and again, another book I'd never read, Octavia Butler. So
yeah, I didn't start reading that. I think it was 5 or 6 years ago. Somebody recommended it to me, and I'd seen it a million times and hadn't read it. And then somebody was like, "Please, you have to stop what you're doing and read it." And it was revelatory.
Yeah, my eldest had been reading it at Jefferson High School here in Portland, and came to me and was like, "You have to read this."
Yeah.
And again, the problem with being a writer is, the stack is super high. And always. I don't know how much time we have left. I feel
sadly we've gone 5 minutes over because I've just been having such a good time.
Sorry.
So I just let it run long. But we will, for everyone who is here now and any one of your colleagues who couldn't make it, but have time later in the day, I did want to let everybody know that Greg will be back with us at 3:50 p.m. That's the Eastern time. So come back and join us at 3:50. And before we let everybody go, Greg, where can they find you outside of this conference?
I use Discord and I'm on Instagram. I am known for my hatred of all social media, so my profile tends to be really low. But there is a Discord server that is the Lazarus fan server. You can find the address and the QR code in the back of the issues. And it's a really great community. And it's not only about Lazarus, like all books and movies and politics, people discuss everything there. It's very welcoming. And it's curated, meaning that people have to behave themselves. And yeah, I'm on Instagram, but I've only recently gone back to it because, as I've said, I hate social media. And Facebook is evil, and they can change the name, but it doesn't make it less evil.
No, somehow it made it more evil.
Well, no, all I can imagine is I'm hoping Neil Stephenson is having some very good conversations with attorneys right now about how do we use this to break up Facebook. Because I think there's a case. Do not attach my name to your inferior product might be the argument. So please. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thanks everybody for listening in. I hope you were mildly entertained. And I will be quiet and go now because I'm screwing your schedule up. So
well, have a wonderful day.
I'll see you in a couple hours.
All right, see you in a couple hours. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.